Hi, Mothers of America. Welcome to our cottage meeting today. I don't know about you, but I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and it has been a cold, wintry last few days. School has been closed, even though public schools are virtual here. They had to close virtual schools for some snow play dates, I guess. But it was so good to be all with you here this morning. My name is Julene Jackson. I'm the National Vice President for Moms for America over cottage meetings. And I've been involved with Moms for America for over a decade. The whole premise behind Moms for America is that liberty begins at home. And when Mama loves America and understands the miracles and the stories of America, her children and grandchildren will hold this same reverence. We can't necessarily depend on our school systems teaching these beautiful truths to our children anymore. That's why it's so important that mothers understand and know and have a knowledge of the history of America so she can pass that on to her children and to her loved ones. So I'm so glad you've joined us for the Healing of America seminars. We're on our third seminar today, section 3 out of our first book, God's Hand in Building of America. There are 4 sections in each book. So you will want to start thinking about purchasing that second book called The Charter of Freedom. And we're going to do a dive into the Constitution and talk about the most important parts of the Constitution over the next 4 weeks, starting in 2 weeks from now. So we have today and next week to finish out our God's Hand in Building of America. And then we'll start on our second seminar, The Charter of Freedom. And so if you can't find those books, they're a little bit slow in coming into our distribution center for Moms for America storehouse. You can also purchase the books at kimbercurriculum.com. kimbercurriculum.com. They have them in stock and you can purchase them directly. And I believe they're $14.99 versus $12, but they will give you a 20% discount if you let them know that you're with Moms for America at kimbercurriculum.com. Also, if you for some reason can't be a part of our cottage meeting live, it usually takes 2 to 3 days to get the class that was presented up online on our website. So just know that you can watch the recorded classes online a few days after the actual class on Wednesday, usually Friday or Saturday. And so thank you so much. I hope you've been enjoying filling in your blanks. Remember, when you fill in the blanks, you actually comprehend more. Studies show in universities that when you can listen and you can hear and you can have multiple sensory experiences and write in script, your comprehension of the subject matter is greater. So that's some of the brilliance behind our filling in the blanks. And I always forget to say the key, all the answers to each section are at the back of each book. I don't expect you to just osmosisly know the answers to these fill in the blanks. The key is in the back. And so the last 2 weeks of our Healing of America seminar, the first week, we talked about the events and the people that led the way to freedom, what was going on in Spain with Christopher Columbus, what was going on in France with little Joan saving her country. So 350 years later, France could come to our aid. And we're going to talk about that Battle of Yorktown and how the French ships came and saved the day today, and the Revolutionary War chapters that we'll be discussing. And also that first seminar, we talked about the Pilgrims and how they felt they were under covenant to come to this land and perform a mission for God. And he would do his part, and he would protect them, and he would spare them, and he would allow these generations to begin to secure and settle this land. And then last week, we talked about the people that were raised up for this very purpose. Samuel Adams, who was known as the father of the Revolutionary War, great patriot and provocateur, and the genius of Thomas Jefferson and how he really had been saved for a time such as this, and his study and education to be able to glean those ancient principles and have them be the means of weaving them into that Declaration of Independence, which he was given that assignment, and ultimately drafting these constitutional Virginia drafts that we would ultimately used to form the Constitution. And the Constitution will be our last seminar section for next week. Okay, let's turn to section 3, the war that set them free. Now, it was kind of a short assignment this week. There was only 5 pages, but they were meaty, juicy stories as I kind of dug into some of those battles. And I'm not a real battle girl. Maybe typically women don't really get into the wars. Maybe some do. But what I love was the stories behind some of these some of these battles, and the miracles. And I just found them so inspiring to me that, God is there, and he's in the details of our lives. And he certainly was in the details of these soldiers and General Washington, and inspiring miracles and the right people at the right time to show up when they needed to. So the first U.S. Constitution almost lost the war for Americans. That it was known as the Articles of Confederation. And it was kind of a loosely drawn document that didn't really have any teeth, so to speak. The Articles of Confederation were actually adopted a year after 1776 and 1777, and it really left the central government weak and the states vigorously independent. And truly, those articles almost lost the Revolutionary War for the United States because there was no executive branch. I think they were so afraid of kingly governments that they just excluded a president or the idea of a king. There was no federal judicial system in this first little constitution, the Articles of Confederation. The colonists really didn't have any experience with the judicial judges or courts because the king in England had always run the courts. So there was no federal system established in this Article of Confederation. They had no power to tax. So imagine, they needed money to give the little soldiers their salaries and for ammunition and for food and for supplies. But the Articles of Confederation had no way to enforce the monies needed from the states. So they just had to hope that the states would cooperate. And that wasn't always the case. So Congress hadn't quite figured out the balanced center of the political spectrum to which Jefferson said was going to be so essential. And these Articles of Confederation were really more closely to anarchy. So look at that little diagram there, kind of the spectrum of tyranny on one hand and 100% anarchy on the other. And you can see the Articles of Confederation leaned a little bit more towards anarchy and not enough law for proper, order, law and order, so to speak. And it's kind of like democracy. And democracy really is a mob rule where people vote on every law, every decision, and that's impossible in a country that has millions and millions of people. And so I sometimes, when I hear certain political leaders talk about this democracy, I think, don't they know history? We're not a democracy, we're a republic. We go to the booth every 2 years and we vote someone in that then goes and represents our needs and our wants, and that's a republic. And then on the other hand, you have 100% tyranny, which is like considered anciently in old days throughout history as ruler's law, this kingly law. And we know when unrighteous kings would rule, the people would mourn. It had a devastating effect on people. And most throughout history, there haven't been good moral kings. And so Thomas Jefferson studied, histories and governments, and he hit upon, remember last week we talked about in Deuteronomy and Exodus and Numbers, this representative government that Moses had established in the Bible, and that the Anglo-Saxons were living under these same ancient principles to which many believe the Anglo-Saxons were descendants of the tribes of Israel that fled during the wars with the Babylonians and the Persians anciently. And so in spite of all the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, there still were some valuable principles, and over 50 of those provisions ultimately were going to be included in the Declaration, or in the Constitution in 1787. So despite the weak articles, the war now was on in full force. And it was frustrating 8 years. The Revolutionary War was 8 years. And the Americans were caught without a real well-structured system of a strong central government. And they were facing the most powerful empire on the earth at that time in England, with the largest army and the most powerful navy in the world. So it was almost like little David versus Goliath. Our little David had no trained army. We had no navy. We had no money to finance this war. We were just at the mercy of states that would give us their monies. And they're also going on at this time. There was about 3 million colonists that lived on that eastern seaboard there. 3 million people, and only about 3% were true patriots. And about 3% of those 3 million were actually loyalists. So they were very opposed to independence and actually fought with the British against the Patriots. And then about 94% were just kind of ambivalent, just farming their lands and apathetic. You almost, if you look at America today, I wonder if we still might fall into that category. Is there about 3% that are true patriots? I consider you the 3%, mamas, taking classes that can help you shore up your family and your neighborhood and ultimately the country. And then do we have about 3% that are true enemies of America, that actually want to destroy this republic and bring on another form of government? And then would you say about 94% of most Americans are apathetic? I mean, they might have voted, but regardless of who wins, they go back to their home and they're about just trying to earn a living and get through each day. I wonder if that's true. So if there were to be, what is 3% of, there's 320 million people in America now, 3% would be 9.6 million people that are willing to fight for this country, fight for this republic, fight for their families, their God, their right to, worship as they please. It's just interesting how God throughout history has worked with small numbers. Sometimes we think it has to be the majority of the people for, for us to achieve a victory. And that typically is not, as you study the Bible. God works by small and simple means to bring about his purposes. And we certainly saw that during this revolutionary time. And so even France, who really did come to our aid at the end of the Revolutionary War, wasn't that helpful when it came to, supplying troops or other supports until the very end, that Battle of Yorktown. And we'll talk about that today. So we were pretty much on our own. I love this book. If I could recommend a book, it's called Promises of the Constitution. And we use this we refer to this when we teach our 12 introductory lessons in the Cottage Meeting Manual. And this is one of the resources I would really recommend getting. You can get it in the store, the Moms for America store. Pam Openshaw is the author, and she gives little vignettes explaining certain events throughout history. And they're only about a page and a half. And for many years, I'd read little sections to my children about certain wars, or the Electoral College, or the Federalist Papers, or what a president does, the different offices and the branches of the government. It's so good. And I love what she had to say here about really how we shouldn't have won. America's will to win was her greatest strength. The Americans fought for their freedom, their homes, their wives and children, and the right to govern themselves. They were independent, rugged individuals infused with the spirit of national pride and a national justice of God. Justice of God. Just as David stood against the champion of the Philistines, With only his sling and stones, the Americans faced the British with a few men and weapons. Like David, they believed that they came in the name of the Lord of hosts in 1 Samuel 17:45 in the Bible to fight their Goliath. Their faith in the rightness of their cause led them to believe that God would deliver them and that Americans were stronger than they appeared. I love that. So even though defeat seemed like the logical end here during this Revolutionary War, obviously we know it wasn't. Although last week we talked about 1776, we think of that as such a glorious year. We won our independence, but it was a miserable, difficult year for those that were actually living it. And the latter part of 1776 proved to be even more disastrous than the first part of 1776. So during the summer of 1776, the British war was on, and they had mobilized the largest army ever assembled in the North American continent. And they also brought over their largest fleet that had ever been seen in the Western Hemisphere. And the battle for New York in the summer of 1776 on into the fall went very poorly. And without a navy, Washington could do little more than put up a token resistance. They were driven from Long Island, and by the fall in September, they were forced to abandon New York. New York at the time was the second largest city in America. It had 22,000 people. And the city was actually going to be burnt down just a few weeks after they evacuated. So Washington flees with his troops out of New York. They're trapped on the shores of Brooklyn in September. There's 20,000 British soldiers and 400 of the British ships coming after them. And they're on this East River. Imagine the shores of Brooklyn overlooking Manhattan. And ferocious winds come and blow the British ships downriver, so they can't get to them that evening. And so they decide that they're going to wait until the morning to capture George Washington and his 9,000, which was essentially all the soldiers in the army at that point. And that night, George Washington did the unthinkable. He shuttled 9,000 troops back and forth across the East River with the winds. And they set decoy fires, the Americans, the soldiers, which made the British think that they were camping out there for the night, but they were really going back and forth. And then as the sun came up that morning and they could actually probably with their eyes see what was going on, this mysterious fog rolls in and they can't see even their hand before their face, which allowed all the troops to safely be evacuated. George Washington said, "The finger of Providence blinded the eyes of our enemies that evening and that morning." Nevertheless, morale was really low. They were short on supplies. There wasn't enough food. There wasn't a proper ammunition. And George Washington knew they needed a win. He said, if we do not have a victory, there would be death. That would be the end of them. Remember that they had signed that declaration with their lives, their honor, their blood, and they would be hung and killed if they were caught, and I don't even think it was so much he was fearful of his life, but he knew that would be, that would be the end of probably a lot of people's lives, his life and those that were fighting. And certainly there would not be America. And so it takes us to Washington's Crossing on Christmas Day, 1776. So he knew that if they didn't have a win here, the enlistments were going to be up and the soldiers were going to leave because they had just known defeat up until this point. And so on Christmas afternoon, he shuttles 2,400 soldiers across. Now, when we think of Washington crossing the Delaware, you think it happened in Delaware, but the Delaware River goes, the point where they crossed was on one side was Pennsylvania and on the other side was New Jersey. So they were on the Pennsylvania side. And that afternoon and all through the night, they crossed in these big boats across the river, the ice, and a blizzard hit as they got on the other side of New Jersey. They then had to march 10 miles through a blizzard up to Trenton. And there they surprised 1,500 Haitian soldiers and were able to capture them. Now, so often they used German Haitian soldiers, the British did, because a lot of the English didn't want to fight against some of their ancestors. And so they would hire out these Haitian soldiers, and they surprised these Haitian soldiers. And this was like the first significant victory of the war. And so George Washington was able to convince his troops to stay on, to re-enlist, and they went on to take Princeton. And that time period from January 26th to, December 26th, January 3rd, was really known as the 10 crucial days when he was able to retain his little force because of the victories that they had in Trenton and Princeton. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this area called Washington Crossings. But girls, you got to put it on your bucket list to take your children or your grandchildren or your husband or someone who loves high adventure. It's just about 2 hours from where I live in the Washington, D.C. area. There's a marvelous visitor center there. And they've recreated these buildings of the McConkey Ferry Inn and I actually don't think they recreated it. I think the buildings, I think the foundations still exist. And then they just repaired, the buildings that were in disarray. But this is where George Washington ate his last meal that Christmas afternoon before he crossed. And the Thompson Neely farm is there. That's where the soldiers stayed and some of the officers, and the big boat barn with the big ships that they've made replicas of. And every Christmas, they have a reenactment of Washington crossing the Delaware. And there's a Washington dressed up, and he crosses, and then he gives a speech to anyone that's there. And thousands of people attend every Christmas. If you have nothing to do one Christmas and you're in the area, I've spoken to people that have gone, and they have said it is fabulous. And of course, they didn't do it this year. There was a virtual crossing. I would definitely say hold off until there's a live crossing. But there is a spirit. I went there this summer and this fall, Washington Crossing. And once again, there's a spirit about these places where these sacred events occurred, where God's hand definitely was in the events. And so it's a wonderful place to visit. Washington's Crossing. It exists. It's real. And it's a delightful day. And so, there were many heroes in the Revolutionary War, but for sheer grit and steel-girded fortitude, none exceeded George Washington. George left a life that he loved in Mount Vernon, Virginia, his home, Mount Vernon, on the banks of the Potomac River. At the time of the Revolutionary War, he was a prominent farmer. He had 5 farms. He loved agriculture and his animals and his dogs. So he left his heart, Mount Vernon, and he left his love, Martha, to go fight a miserable 8 years of battles in the cold and harsh conditions. There were 21 battles of the Revolutionary War over the course of 8 years. America won 10 battles, the British won 9, and there were 2 draws. Now, Martha oftentimes would go at her expense. It was because it was dangerous for her to get there, but she would go and spend winters with her husband, because they were lonely, anxiety-ridden time for George Washington. We know that she was for almost 6 months in Valley Forge, and she would organize the daily meals for the staff. She would entertain the officers or their little wives that would come visit. She would mend the soldiers' clothing. She would knit socks. She would go out amongst the soldiers and care for them, and overall just provide comfort and cheer in a very dismal situation. And as I think of little Martha in the camps at Valley Forge, offering this kind of hope, I think that's what we women have always done. This is a part of our wiring and our special role and mission I think God has given women, is to offer cheer and hope when things look pretty dire. And I think that's why it's so important, mothers, that we remain anchored in hope at this time so we can shore up our children that might be being susceptible to the messages that they're seeing in mainstream media or on social media, or our husbands who are despondent, who might have lost a job or wondering, how he's going to provide for his family. I really do believe that Martha went to uphold her husband, George, so that General Washington could in turn uphold those troops and ultimately uphold the nation. So the work that women have always done behind the scenes is, I almost think, the most valuable work. And we saw that certainly in Martha Washington. So during Valley Forge, so Washington's crossing happened in 1776, and Valley Forge happened from December of 1776, a year later, and they were there for 6 months at Valley Forge. Now, the British troops had taken over Philadelphia too at this point, so they now had New York and Philadelphia, the first and second largest cities in America, and the Congress had fled to York, Pennsylvania. So Washington set up his troops for the winter in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to kind of train and regroup from that year's battles. Now, it was a particularly dire time that winter of 1776. Over 2,000 of his troops died of disease at Valley Forge. And this is the time when you see the great picture of him praying in Valley Forge with his horse. And stories have been told that some of his officers were going to tell him that they were leaving, that they were going back home, and they see their great general on his knees in the woods petitioning God for help, and they just couldn't desert him. And so they went back to their little huts and their encampments. And there's a Mr. Potts who had a house on the land at Valley Forge, and the house is still there. I was just there a few months ago, the Potts home. And he wasn't really a fan of the Patriots, to be honest with you. He was more of a Tory, but he said he one time was out in the woods and he stumbled upon this great general praying to God. And he said his heart changed that day and he became a patriot. And he has written about that experience of seeing General Washington out in the woods petitioning God for help. And help did come. A wonderful Prussian general officer by the name of Baron von Steuben came, and he trained up the men during the 6 months that they were in Valley Forge, and he taught them new skills and how to load the rifles faster. And they became a more unified army during that 6 months in Valley Forge. And even though the war would go on for another 5 years, they really say Valley Forge was the key turning point at that time, because those troops left more confident and better trained to go on and fight. Now, if girls, on your bucket list again, if you've not been to Valley Forge, it's 26 miles of beautiful bike trails. You can rent a bike at Valley Forge, or you can take your bikes there. And they've recreated these huts that the soldiers stayed in for the winter, and these encampments and redoubts, these buildups, and the Washington's headquarters, and there's beautiful monuments on the trails, and there's this George Washington Memorial Chapel where they have a monument to the grieving mothers, and it's breathtaking when you see it. So put that on your list of places to visit. You can spend the whole day at Valley Forge on your bike, riding these trails and stopping off at these markers and these houses and reading and just feeling the spirit of the land and the miracles and the greatness that was achieved there at Valley Forge. If nothing else, building the hearts and souls and minds. It started out badly in Valley Forge, but when they left in June, it was the 4th largest city in America, Valley Forge. And when they left, they took down all the huts. And a year later, when George Washington came back to Valley Forge, it was just farmland. And it made him so happy because he was a farmer. And that's, he was so impressed how they were able to rehabilitate land after Valley Forge. And so we're on to our last battle, the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The British General Cornwallis was the general of the British troops, and he had suffered some great losses with Washington, and so he raced to Yorktown. Yorktown is kind of coastal in Virginia, and he hoped to be saved by some of the British ships that would have been there that they could have hopped on to evacuate. But instead, hallelujah, the French warships finally arrived, took out these British ships that had to limp on back to New York for repairs. And when Washington saw what had happened, he knew that this was his moment, and he surrounded the troops there, the British troops at Yorktown, and Cornwallis surrendered. Now, Yorktown is just about 15 minutes from colonial Williamsburg, and Jamestown is just about 10 minutes from colonial Williamsburg. So that's a beautiful place to take your family or go on a trip. You can spend 3, 4, or 5 days there and hit up Yorktown, that has almost a brand new visitor center a couple of years ago, and they've recreated the camps, and there's the war fields are there, and then of course colonial Williamsburg, and then Jamestown, where our first earliest settlers came. And so that's a great place to be able to take your family and to just feel, the beauty of that American history. So sure enough, the English people just did not, King George wanted to keep fighting, but the Brits had grown tired of war, and both the armies were exhausted. And the one thing that set the Americans apart from the British, though, is that the Americans just refused to admit defeat. And so we just sufficiently wore out the hearts of the English people, and the King of England acknowledged in 1783 that indeed they had lost and that the United States had gained their independence. And this Treaty of Independence was actually signed and read by George Washington on the 8th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. And so George Washington waited for all the British troops to pack up and head out before he entered the city of New York in 1783. And there he was going to have a dinner with his officers and bid them farewell at Francis's Tavern in New York City. Now, I don't know if you know, but Francis's Tavern still exists in New York City. It's a restaurant, and it's right in the Wall Street, kind of that Pearl District, financial district. And you can go and eat there. It's much like the taverns in colonial Williamsburg. And so it's fun to go and eat there. And then there's a museum on the second floor. And on the second floor of Francis's Tavern in New York City is where George Washington had dinner for his officers that December of 1783. And George Washington said, "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter years may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable." And after his farewell to them, it said that from eyewitnesses, he wept as he took each officer in his hand and said kind words to them. And it was said that they had never before seen such a scene of sorrow and weeping as George Washington bade farewell to his officers, who I'm sure for years had stood by his side and fought through thick and thin. And that's why going to Francis's Tavern, you don't just get a colonial meal, but you just are kind of infused with the sentiments and the events that took place there. So it exists. Put that on your list. Next time you go to New York City, a Broadway show and lunch or dinner at Francis's Tavern. I'm sure it's closed right now for COVID, but anyways, it is there. And so from New York, George Washington 2 weeks later would resign his commission as commander-in-chief to the Congress that was meeting temporarily in Annapolis, Maryland. And it said as he gave his speech to the Congress and to those that were watching, he always spoke of God and how God intervened during that 8-year war. And then when he spoke of his appreciation for his officers, again, emotion welled up in him and his voice faltered and kind of sank, and he couldn't continue on. And the spectators of that speech said that there was not, it said, all the spectators wept, and hardly a member of Congress who did not drop tears. And so he was a beloved man, obviously, and you sense that in the great affection that he had for those that he served with for 8 years. And then 2 days later, it was Christmas, and he came home Christmas night in 1783 after 8 years of being gone from Mount Vernon, a place that he loved and longed for so much. I think it's interesting, and he thought when he arrived there that that is where he would remain the rest of his life. Not hardly, huh? Isn't that what we think sometimes when God really tries us with a real trial in our life and we survive it, we get through it, that we think surely God won't test us again. And inevitably he does, because he's prepared us with our past trials to endure what might even be ahead. And that's certainly what he had done with George Washington. It's interesting, when George Washington got home, his little Mount Vernon was in financial disrepair. He was deeply in debt. He was so embarrassed over the course of that first year. He had to turn away the sheriff 3 times because of bills that were due that he wasn't able to pay. There even was a polite letter sent to him from his church saying that his rent on his pew was overdue. So imagine this great General Washington, who saved America, came home and still had to figure out how he was going to pay the bills. And I think, once again, sometimes I think when we've been tried and tested, we just assume God is going to pave the way for our success in all ways because he's tried us. And that's not true. He keeps us ever humble. Even when we're doing good things, we are still, sometimes things continue to not go our way. And so, I love that story of Mount Vernon. I don't know if you can see. Oh, they're right there. I'm pointing to it. On my mantle, I have a picture of Mount Vernon. And for years, when I would teach my children with my husband in the morning in our little family devotional, and we'd tell them stories of American history, I would oftentimes point to Mount Vernon and say, look, George Washington loved Mount Vernon. That was the desire of his heart. He didn't want to fight in the war for 8 years, and he definitely didn't want to go and be president of the United States for 8 more years. He was away from Mount Vernon as much as he was there. He lived there for 16 years. He was away from Mount Vernon for 16 years. But because he did what God was telling him, what he knew in his heart he needed to be done, it made all the difference in our lives today. And I would tell that story to my children all the time, that there will be times when you will feel in your heart you need to do something, but you don't want to do it. It is difficult, it is inconvenient. And my little girl served a mission for our church when she was 19 years old in the Amazon River. For 18 months, she lived in the jungle, so to speak. And it was so hard for her. I mean, they had dirt roads, and there was lice and rats and jungle fever. And when I would talk to her, sometimes she would weep. And she's like, oh, Mom, this is so hard. I just feel like coming home. But she stuck it out, bless her heart. And when she came home, she said, Mom, oftentimes in my most desperate moments, when I just wanted to come home, I would think of you pointing to that story of Mount Vernon and how George Washington just longed for the ease of his life, Mount Vernon, but he stayed the course. And she said, I somehow knew that if I just stayed the course, it would make the difference, all the difference to someone. And I've heard her say, it made really, Mom, all the difference to me, as that little girl came home and has gone on to do amazing things. And so that is what the story of some of these stories can do to our children and grandchildren as we infuse them in their hearts. And I've seen it firsthand as my kids. I'll tell you one time for another time when my boy entered the NBA and remembered George Washington praying on his knees in Valley Forge, and the significance of that kid praying on his knees at various times in his career. And so, anyways, I didn't tell you girls, but when George Washington was in Valley Forge, he had a vision. He was tired one day, and he went to his room and he told his officer, "Please don't disturb me." And as he began to lay down, his room lit up and an angel appeared to him. And this angel showed him the span of America from the beginning to now, to the end of the war. He showed him that they were going to prevail, that God was going to help them prevail, and also to the end of America when God would come again. And George Washington never spoke of this vision. He had one of his officers at that time, when he came in, he told him about it. And he said, "Will you write this down?" He said, "I don't want you to ever show anyone a history of this vision until I've died 20 years after my death." And this vision was recorded, and it's in the Library of Congress. And if you just Google, George Washington Prophecy of America Vision 1777, it will come up, this vision. I just watched it YouTube by Trey Smith, but there's all kind of little YouTubes explaining this vision. And there's also a lot of people that debunk this vision and say, this is just a tall tale. But I believe in that vision. I believe that almost God had to show him or reassure him he was going to win, or else he would have lost heart, because he really was little David going up against a Goliath. But after that vision, after Valley Forge, he never doubted, and he led those troops. And so it's amazing that vision, study it out and see. And, I think God might not give us mothers visions, but when we get on our knees to pray, when we're worried about a child or a marriage or our community or this nation, that as we continue to pray to him, he gives us reassurances that it's going to be okay. And he gives in our hearts the things that we need to do, how to do our part. And that's how God works. And he reassured George Washington that day in Valley Forge, and he will reassure us as we make constant communication with him, something that we do in our life. And so sure enough, after the war, we're at the end here, Thomas Jefferson compiled his final draft of a constitution, and he was going to be called to be an ambassador in France for several years, but he had this draft that he was going to give to his dear friend, James Madison, who was also a Virginian. And John Adams and Madison knew that Jefferson had tapped into this divine science or natural law of sound government that was had throughout history and found in the scripture and the Bibles. And that from these natural laws, a prosperous and a dynamic economy could come forth with a high standard of living. And wouldn't you know, another, I think, miracle right at this time when America was breaking free in 1776, an economist in Scotland by the name of Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, outlining free market principles. And in this book, Adam Smith said, wealth isn't gold or it's not silver, but it is the essentials of life. Wealth is food, adequate clothing, houses, transportation, communications, schools, good roads, factories, well-cultivated farms. This is wealth. And Adam Smith, in this book, Wealth of Nations, which is a famous book, some might have studied it in college, he puts forth these free market principles that are so instinctive to us now, because that's all we've ever known and lived under, is specialized production and having a free market and supply and demand and the ability to make a profit. And how the free market is the best form of competition. And when you have greater quantity, it improves the quality of things. And when you lower prices, it allows more people to be able to compete. And when you have a variety of goods, it satisfies the different demands. And so instinctively, we know these in the most intuitive sense, these work. But, back in that time, this was all new to them. No country had ever exercised these free market principles that Adam Smith was putting forth in his book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. And I think the enemies of America and capitalism and the free market are nervous to this day about these principles. And they kind of want to save us from ourselves and put kind of restrictions and regulations on the free market. In the 5,000-Year Leap, this wonderful book that sets forth 28 principles of liberty that our founders used to form this country, the 15th principle says, and that our founders knew, that the highest level of prosperity occurs when there's a free market economy and a minimum of government regulations. Now, 50 years after this Wealth of Nations book, another classic book about free market principles came out by Frederick Bastiat. He was a French economist, and he said the same thing, that the greatest single threat to liberty is the government. Adam Smith said, the greatest threat to the free market economy is government interference. And Frederick Bastiat said the same thing. The single greatest threat to liberty is government. That human nature is the best to regulate the free market for far more effectively than regulation, that only limited and carefully defined powers, Principle 19 says, only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to the government, and all others should be retained in the people. And Adam Smith said that the role of government was simply to serve as a referee to protect and prevent against illegal force, kind of mafia tactics that might be referred to today, or fraud. Think about fraudulent elections today. They're to prevent against monopoly. Now, this is Adam Smith in 1776. Think of the monopolies that we're seeing now with big tech and the monopolies with Microsoft and Amazon. And also the role of government should serve or prevent against debauchery, which would maybe come in the form of obscenity or drugs or pornography or prostitution. And Adam Smith summarized his formula for prosperity with these following principles. Give the people the right to try, to buy, to sell, to fail. Don't bail them out. When people have the freedom to do these things, they're actually more responsible. They're more careful when they know that there are risks involved. I always try and explain free market principles to my children, like the difference between a football player and a rugby player. So think of football in America. All the players wear all this gear, pads, helmets to reduce their risk of injury. And then think of rugby players, a rugby that's played in Australia or in European countries, where the players wear no gear at all. But there are actually more injuries amongst the NFL players than rugby players. Now, why is that? It's because the rugby players know that there are more risks, so they are smarter about the way that they play. They know that there's not going to be any bailouts, no pads to keep them safe, so they're smarter. And I kind of look at it today with COVID. I would give my kids the modern example. Look at COVID. So many people are looking to the government to solve this problem. You got to give me some stimulus money. Tell me when I can come out of my home. I need a vaccine before I can, feel safe out in the world. Versus my friend who's a doctor, he said, Jolene, if people would just stop drinking their Diet Cokes and Doritos and make lifestyle choices and improve their diets, God formed our body to be able to fight off viruses and disease. And he said, imagine people that have made these choices health choices that naturally will boost their immune systems, how much more freedom and peace of mind they have than people that are just looking to the government to solve COVID and tell them when it's okay to begin to live again. The difference in the level of freedom of looking to government to regulate and tell you what to do versus giving people the freedom to dictate how to live their life and to care for themselves and so forth. So anyways, it's interesting to know that when Adam Smith published his new book, no country in the world was practicing these free market principles, and the United States was the first nation to try these free market principles. And wouldn't you know, at that time in the 1780s, even though the America only made up 6% of the world's population and only held 7% of the world mass, within the first 100 years of working under these free market principles, they were now producing over 50% of the world's wealth. So it works. And Thomas Jefferson, he knew that. And he gives this marvelous quote about being able to manage our own affairs on the last page in our own way for our use, unembarrassed by too many regulations, unoppressed by fiscal exactions. Agriculture, manufacturers, commerce, and navigation, the four pillars of our prosperity, are the most thriving when left most free to individual enterprise. And so we see that next week, they're going to take this monumental task of forming the Constitution now. And that would happen several years after they won the war. In 1787, they were going to meet in Philadelphia, and they were going to meet in this constitutional convention. And the founders would say it was a miracle that this Constitution came to be, and it truly was struck off by the hand of God, is what they're going to say. So it's a delicious reading next week as well. I hope mamas and grandmas, that you're beginning to see very clearly that God has had a hand in the building of America. As we think about George Washington this week and his little ragtag army beating the largest empire of the world at that time, and the miracles that ensued during the Revolutionary War, the fog and just the courage of George Washington and the visions that he had, and the right people showing up at the right time. Captain von Steuben training the men in Valley Forge, and the French ships coming just at the right time to help them win that last battle of Yorktown. And then you think of the genius of Thomas Jefferson, that God had prepared little Thomas Jefferson's mind and intellect to be able to discern and to begin to compile these drafts of the Constitution that they would use to write this Constitution a few years later. And then the timing of Adam Smith's The Book of the Wealth of Nation. And Adam Smith was a good friend of Benjamin Franklin too. And maybe that's how Benjamin Franklin even knew about this book. Just at the time when they were looking for these principles to form this new government, here comes The Wealth of Nations. So God in heaven, I always say, did not establish this first free people in modern times just to see it collapse in oblivion, which we sometimes might feel like that's the direction that we're heading. God will save America. He has prophesied. He has promised us this in 2 Chronicles. He will heal this land if we do our part. And as we turn to him and make quality family time a high priority. And when I say make family quality time a high priority, I don't know if that means more popcorn and Netflix. That's always good. A family that plays together stays together. But how can we teach our children and our grandchildren these stories and these miracles and the reverence for these great founding fathers and mothers, and the fact that God has always, been involved in America? I had my oldest little girl tell me the other day, she's like, Mom, I got those seminar books. I'm going to start taking the seminars, because she's heard me talk about how I'm teaching these classes online. And I'm like, well, thank you, Jesus. So you just never know the things that you talk about with your children and your grandchildren. Invite your grown children, invite your neighbors to come on and participate on this online class. And And as you begin to learn these principles and learn the Constitution and what this means for you, I know that you will know what to do, that fourth step. And it might be starting your own little cottage meeting in your neighborhood with 4 or 5 like-minded women who feel the way you do. And I certainly, you know, have seen how the cottage meetings have changed my life. And so maybe that's what you might be inspired to do after you finish this 16-week course, or maybe you'll be inspired to run for your school board or to get involved in an organization that exists in your community. Something, you will know. It will look different for each of us girls, but you know, certainly I know George Washington didn't get his break once he came home after his first 8 years away. And for those that really love America and are true patriots, we're all that God has. And so we might not get a break, but as we're engaged in the solution and not just focused on the problem, we become hopeful and we begin to feel God guiding us, and it anchors us in hope. And that's how we anchor our loved ones and our family and our husbands and our neighbors in hope as we do these things to help do our part to heal this land. And so, ladies, we've come to the end of our class today. Sorry, I went a little bit longer than I should have, but I hope that you got something out of class today. Remember, you can go back and tell people that they can watch these classes. They'll be recorded online. And next week, we'll talk about the Constitutional Convention. So for now, we will sign off. I'll stay on as long as I need to. If any of you have any questions about anything I talked about or any of the resources, girls, I forgot to mention one thing. This is my most favorite book, The Real George Washington, and it's an easy read. You can get it on our store, Moms for America store. You can get it on Amazon. The Real George Washington. I just tell you some of my favorite books, not that you have to get any of them, but ultimately you want to kind of build your I Love America library. And this is a really great book, easy read. And you'll just fall in love with George Washington is what you'll do. So anyways, okay, we're going to sign off for now, and we will see you next week, same time, same place. Thanks so much, ladies.